Hello and welcome to the Cloud Chronicles Volume 6, also part 3 of our series on networking. Uh, this is uh, this is going to be on Azure Hub and Spoke topology, and I was supposed to have a screen share here so you could see my pretty thing, and I didn't do that. So let's go ahead and share that because we'll talk a little bit about Hub and Spoke. Uh, John, just introduce yourself in case somebody's new.
Sure. Hi, I'm John Morehouse. I'm a principal consultant with Denny Chen Associates. I've been working with SQL Server and data for a really long time, and as of late, I'm doing a lot of Azure networking stuff. So that's why Joey and I are doing this video series of things.
Yeah, uh, and I'm Joey Dantoni. I'm principal cloud architect at DesignMind, and I'm also been doing a lot of cloud networking stuff, but kind of forever since the cloud was a thing. Because there were no networking experts when I started in this, so I kind of had to figure out a lot of it myself. Our topic today is going to be a really popular network architecture in Azure and to a lesser extent AWS, and this is called hub and spoke networking. There are a number of reasons why you might want to do this in terms of like security and etc. And we'll kind of run through those and walk through the sample. We'll do a couple of demos and kind of explain things. John, why don't you share your experience with Azure networking and some of the stuff you've kind of worked on?
Sure. So I come from originally I'm an accidental DBA, so networking was not in my necessarily. I could hold my own, but I was not a network engineer by any means. So coming into the Azure space, it was a new thing for me when I started to do more Azure related things. And so I had to learn about VNets and subnets and IP routing and firewalls and gateways and all the oh my bears, lions and bears and tigers. And so then I had to learn about how do you create a topology of networking components in Azure that is safe and secure and aligned with best practices, and that's where Hub and Spoke comes in. Hub and Spoke allows us to segregate things nice and cleanly. You and I've had conversations many times about making sure there's a line of demarcation between non-prod and prod, and segregation, network segmentation is important, and even in the cloud, it's important. So Hub and Spoke allows us to do that.
For sure. I can't remember who I was talking to the other day. It wasn't Denny, but it was somebody else who's been working in Azure since the beginning. And there was no concept of this when we first had Azure. Like there was a network, and I think you could have like one network per region or something. It was awful. And yeah, the thing that has really enabled this is this concept called VNet peering that we're going to talk about today. In the early days, you had to have like a VPN if you
It
wanted
was
to connect
painful.
to virtual networks, and that's not the case anymore, and that does simplify things a lot. Um, the general idea of hub and spoke technology is, like John mentioned, a security aspect. It's also kind of a cost management aspect. Uh, you'll note here we have our. Let me go back to screen share, and I'll talk through this demonstration or
Go back to the slides.
slides. Yep, and you'll know we have a hub virtual network. There's an Azure Bastion. If you're not familiar with Azure Bastion, it's a remote desktop service that runs on port 443, allows you to secure, or 22, to allow you to securely access Windows or Linux servers. Um, there's an Azure firewall, and there's a VPN gateway and express route. The key thing in this hub, those are all of our centralized networking components. Uh, there are a couple reasons for that. You can't peer two networks that have VPN gateways in them, so that's the first problem. But secondly, you wouldn't want to have multiple VPN gateways in the same kind of hub and spoke technology because that's something you have to pay for. And like John mentioned, this facilitates a number of things. It gives us a centralized way to put our core network resources in one place. And also secondarily, it gives us some security. So this is a pretty complicated mapping here. You see we got some forced tunnels, and we'll talk more about user-defined routes and such later. Uh, but effectively, what's going to happen in this kind of scenario is all these spoke networks are going to hang off of the hub network. They're probably going to have a route table that's going to route their table through a firewall or network virtual appliance. Frankly, the way you configure that for Azure Firewall versus any standard virtual network or any third-party virtual network appliance is going to be pretty much the same. The VPN is going to live there. You might have different designs where your domain controllers live in the hub, or they might live in a spoke, depending on how you design this. There are a couple of different ways to approach that. The key thing about domain controllers there being it's DNS. John, anything else you want to add about kind of this design or any other kind of variants of this design you've
The
seen?
only thing I will say is that Azure Bastion is the best thing since sliced bread. If like Joey said, if you haven't seen it, you should really go look at that capabilities to manage your virtual machines via RDP via browser. The I always think of hub and spoke like a wagon wheel, and I think that this image doesn't really.
Yeah.
You can kind of see that wagon wheel. I wish that hub virtual network was kind of in the middle,
Yeah.
because that's really the concept, right? You have a wagon wheel where the hub in the
We have
middle.
an
Yeah,
actual hub
we have a hub and spoke. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Right. So your axle is the hub, and then the spokes are going off to the tires and the outer rim, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how I always think
Yeah.
of hub and spoke.
Yeah.
And then we have, we can do pairing between the VNets and the hub, and help do isolation as well.
Yeah, some other key points to understand here is typically your hub and spoke architecture is going to be per region. There may be scenarios where you have it go cross region, but typically you're going to have a hub and spoke in each region you want to operate in. Uh, and kind of the reason why you do see a lot of architectural diagrams with this on the edge is because that does have edge resources. So when you're
Sure.
showing it, and I think that the catch here is we're showing that connection back to either on-prem or another cloud or something like that. So that hub network ends up being at the edge of that network diagram. But yeah, I agree with you. It's a little bit easier to see. And here you can see this one's broken into a couple of production spokes and a couple of non-production spokes, and that's one way to do this. Another way to do it might be to kind of have clients, and I know I've built that for a software as a service vendor, where they had their core hub, and then each client had their own spoke network, and maybe they had a couple of other ones for core resources because they also had things like domain controllers. But yeah, that's the general idea, and peering's the feature that lets us take advantage of that. And let's kind of while we're screen sharing, let's go ahead and do a demo, and I'll make this bigger so everybody can see it. This is our Cloud Chronicles networking resource group, and we have our hub here. We built this, I think, a couple of
Weeks ago.
because we have like a VPN here. Let me see, connected devices. Yeah, we have our gateway hub here. So what we're going to do here is peer our newly created spokes, and I think I called one hub spoke SQL. There's probably a better naming standard for this. Here I'm going to select my virtual network, and I'm going to see SQL Server spoke. So I'll call this SQL Server. And we have a couple of different options here. So we have allow VNet SQL Server to access VNet subname hub, allow it to receive forwarded traffic. We don't want to allow gateway traffic from that network, but we do want to
Allow traffic
from the hub. Oh, and we don't. Let me make sure I have this right. Oh yeah, and this guy has to be able to forward traffic.
And I remember back when this was setting up peering was complicated and irritating. So it made it easier, over the past couple of years.
Yeah, and one of the things you should note, because I've done this a few different ways. So here I'm these names we're putting in are all just metadata. They're not anything specific. One of the things you should note is that this is really easy to do in the portal, by the way. So I'm going to do this. It just adds the peering. You'll note we get two boxes over there that peer on both sides. If you do this in any sort of code-driven way, whether it's Terraform, PowerShell, Bicep, etc., you have to actually execute the command twice. If you see the PowerShell commandlets, it kind of makes sense because the way those gateway commands are flagged, you obviously can't do it twice. And what you want to see here is fully synchronized. And if you don't see that and you've done it via code, I think it's just like action pending. It means you have to do it to the other network. If you do this in the portal, you only have to touch it once. If you do it in code, you have to touch both virtual networks, and that's kind of the key difference. Which, to John's point, was how it used to be in the portal. You used to have to go to two places to do this. So it's pretty basic there, but it makes sense. So, John, what are some of the ways you might break down spoke VNets into various functions? Like how would you think about it from a client perspective?
So I think that's a good question. I like I think mostly I like putting infrastructure things like domain controllers in a different spoke.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about putting that domain controller on that edge, like what you mentioned, that makes me
Yeah.
From a security perspective, I don't want my domain controllers that close to the edge.
Hmm.
But as you mentioned, you could put that into that hub, and that
To your point, you could protect them being via subnetting, right? So, like, one of the things that I think it's important to understand, just because a network has a public IP, and I completely understand John's point, but just because like there's a gateway and a public IP, the only resources that need to have access to that inbound, or it can be in a single subnet. So you could secure it. But I'm with John. I like to put my domain controllers like in their own VNet just for safety.
so I would typically have like an infrastructure
Hmm.
VNet, if you will, and put everything infrastructure related, domain controllers, file servers, DNS servers, all into that one VNet, and then I will break it out. Typically, like production and non-production.
Hmm.
Obviously, some organizations have multi-tier non-production environments. Development, staging, pre-prod, whatever. But I like a very clear separation of production stuff from non-production things to help mitigate any type of attack vectors that hackers are going to want to look for,
Hmm.
and then limit communication from the non-prod side to the production side.
And the other thing too that's nice about that is when you make changes in that environment, you can make changes to like a development environment without having to worry about
Right.
potentially impacting prod. Because like when you're networking stuff is a little bit scary because when it breaks, you can take a
Affect other things.
lot of things down.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, so that's kind of the key element there. Uh, I've seen some other kind of design patterns, like I mentioned earlier, in a software as a service model, you might have each client in their own VNet if you're using IaaS kind of functionality. Uh, I think another way you could potentially do this with or take advantage of this would be with like private link and PaaS resources, right? Like you could put all those resources in one subnet potentially, or excuse me, in one VNet potentially. One other thing to mention that I don't know that we've talked about enough is that it's important to remember a virtual network can only exist in one subscription in one region. So when you're going across regions, you have to have multiple VNets.
Well,
One cost consideration, because we always talk about cost, is peering. Traffic that moves over a peering does incur some cost, but you get a pretty high amount of traffic for free. And it's not something I've ever heard anybody complain about too much, but it is something that is metered and does incur a small cost.
another thing that we didn't mention is IP address space.
Oh yeah, good call.
So if you do pairing with like a hub and spoke model, you need to make sure that the various VNets are not overlapping, because sometimes the portal will tell you that that's an issue, and other times it won't. So we were just talking earlier before we started recording about keeping track of IP address spaces via Excel,
Yeah.
which is a great tool to use. But those address spaces can't overlap if you're going to do peering.
Yeah, so what I've done here, this hub has a 101620, and you can see this the SQL Server spoke has a 22. And let's go ahead and add another peering because I have two networks here. So we'll add our other peering. Let me set it so I remember what I called it.
And it's irritating to troubleshoot that address space issue.
So ADDS spoke hub ADDS. Yeah, it very much is. So there, allow it to receive forwarded traffic, hub spoke, ADDS. And remember on all these, like I said, it's metadata, but you want to, so one of those places it's a good idea to do infrastructure as code because you want to have consistent naming patterns here. So it makes it easy to identify when you're having network troubleshooting issues. And we've designed this to be to work fine. Let me maybe try to add another one because I think I used. Let's see if I have like a network that's got a big IP range. Infrastructure VNet probably has a big IP range. Let's try this. Spoke hub infra hub spoke infra.
They always say don't type in a live demo.
Yeah, I know.
Here you have
Let's
to.
get this to fail. I don't know. I honestly don't know if they might not overlap, and maybe they don't, because I think it would have failed by now. But anyway, like John mentioned, your address space can't. And Another thing to note is you can go across VNet, you can go across resource groups. That's something we didn't really talk about. I'm deploying this all mostly within one resource group just for the simplicity of being able to delete it later. Uh, but a lot of times you might have each of these things in their own resource group. So there's no, other than having contributor permissions on the virtual network, I don't think there's anything security wise that's required to do a peering. So you would have to have in that case a virtual network contributor on both of those VNets in order to implement that. So we've talked about how to configure this and the basic idea of hub and spoke, and some of the services that you might use. I think obviously you're going to use virtual networks and peering, but firewalls and express routes. Those are some of the common things. Having a common Azure Monitor solution, maybe having a common log analytics workspace for all of those resources. And uh, like John mentioned, one of the main reasons why we want to do this is network security. And you want to talk a little bit about lateral movement and how that works when somebody gets into your network who's not supposed to be there?
If you don't segregate, and you and I have been harping on network segmentation for a really long time, and it's still important, right? We used to do it when I remember being on premises and the cloud wasn't a thing yet, way back when, because I'm old. We would do VLANs and separate out
Hmm.
those virtual LANs away from each other to help isolate production, right? And we need to do the same thing in Azure.
Hmm.
If everything's in one VNet and everything can talk to everything, that's a huge attack vector for a hacker once they get in through a developer's machine, a laptop that's connected, and that developer's machine can talk to production. That's a problem.
Yeah, and
Um,
you may not have like here we've only connected our hubs to our spoke. You
right.
may have some scenarios where you have spokes talk to each other. That's not necessarily like an anti-pattern, but you don't want by default all of your spokes to talk to all of your spokes because then there's no point to the design. Uh, like there may be in the scenario here where we have ADDS, like everything would need to be able to talk to ADDS to get DNS records. But you could also you wouldn't necessarily have to. I guess you would have to peer, but then you could use network security groups or firewall to limit the traffic to the ports that ADDS needed. Likewise, so firewall and network security groups do a lot of the same thing, and we'll talk about this more in a later episode. But the big difference is that NSGs are free, but they're also a lot more work to maintain. So you have to specify those things. And where you might do that is like if you had we in this case we have a SQL Server VNet and we have an ADDS VNet. Assume we had an app VNet too, which I don't have here. You might allow inbound traffic via either an app gateway or something else on port 443 into that app VNet. Then you would only allow the app VNet to talk to SQL over 1433, and you wouldn't allow anything else. You might have a management service where you could go back in and use it that way, and then SQL would be able to talk to ADDS to authenticate, and the app may or may not need to talk to ADDS depending if it's internal or external facing. So that's the rough idea of how you kind of route this traffic and use some of the segmentation. Uh, there are some concerns about scaling up, and I think our next episode is going to be on virtual WAN. And I was talking to a colleague at a client about this recently, and John, I kind of shared some of that with you. I think you get a warning if you peer over 5 VNets in the portal. I don't know what the warning relates to exactly, but there are kind of some trade-offs when you start getting a lot of virtual networks in your environment, especially if you're going multi-region, and that's where VWAN might be handy.
So we need to learn about VWAN. I
Yeah,
can't say that fast.
yeah, it's hard
VWAN.
to say. And one of the things that's a big difference between these two designs and patterns is VWAN is a service that costs money. Hub and spoke is just kind of a network design pattern that you're going to implement in your own environment. So you're not necessarily going to you'll incur costs because you do have resources that are going to cost money, but it's not something that's
Yeah, I don't think I've done peering over 5 VNets.
I think I have, but I it was all the project I did it on was all bicep, so I didn't see anything because it was
Yeah,
that
you're gonna get the error in the bicep.
software as a service thing. Yeah, like so. Uh, that was the case. One of the things we haven't talked about much too is user-defined routes. Do you want to explain how that's configured, or can you?
I know the concept. I've actually never done
Yeah.
user-defined routes, but if I wanted traffic to route from via a certain path,
Yeah.
then I can create a user-defined route in the Azure networking space to basically tell Azure, "Hey, I want this traffic to route this way." Um,
And the reason why we do that in Hub and Spoke and why it comes up a lot is with the firewall, right? So you want to say instead of that traffic, and you associate them at the subnet level, um, and you want to say route this traffic instead of routing it direct to its next hop, route it through the Azure firewall and then onto its next hop. So that's like the big place where you use them. I don't know if I've ever done a user defined route that wasn't for some kind of firewall. I
I haven't.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
firewall is the only thing I can think of, and you're right. If I think about other implementations, I think Denny did it though. So on that client,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. There can be some weirdness, like if you want to route something to a specific way or with private endpoints. But yeah, that's the general idea. Uh, One of the things that can be challenging about cloud networking is, and I think we talked about this in our VPN episode, and we had all those errors in our VPN episode, is troubleshooting things when traffic isn't flowing. Uh, and in a real network, you can like run wires and you can do trace routes, and trace routes sometimes work within Azure, sometimes they don't. Any other things you've used for troubleshooting?
the biggest thing I have used is IP flow verify
Yep.
in a network watcher.
Yeah.
That is the cream de cream to figure out whether or not two things can talk,
Yeah.
uh, especially like virtual machines.
Yeah. Yeah.
Other, other non-virtual machines, it's a little bit more difficult.
Yeah. If things have an IP address, it usually works. Where we had this real bad problem with it ended up being DNS because it's always
It's
DNS.
always DNS.
Uh,
It's
but
always
we
DNS.
had a client that had a 40net, and they had Azure SQL on a private link, and it kept trying to resolve or we couldn't figure out where it was pulling the private IP from or the public IP from, and like we were using host files, we had DNS redirection set up right, uh, and I think it was like the 40net was caching something, uh, but that was so painful because the troubleshooting was not intuitive, and it ended up being a combination of a couple of things. But yeah, for VPN to V or a VM to VM or even anything that's got a private IP address, you're pretty good with Network Watcher. The other tool I always like to mention, because I don't know that everybody knows it, is the PowerShell commandlet test network connection.
Yes, that's a good one too.
Yeah, because you can always just like it does not work on our Macs though, by the way. Oddly, that commandlet has some dependency on WinForms for some reason. I have no idea why. But there is a test like net connection. No, test net connection is the command. I think on the Mac, like test connection is the command. It's not Azure Bust. I tend to use on my Mac. I tend to use just Telnet client more. I know Telnet's unsecure,
That's a
but
good. That's a good way to do it too. Is telling it. Good old telling it.
yeah, yeah, for testing purposes, it's fine. You're not actually enabling. You just need to know what your port is and try to hit that. Uh,
I've used Telnet to troubleshoot like private endpoints on like storage accounts.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right.
Good
Make
one.
sure I get resolution. And I can actually touch it.
Yeah, yeah. And typically on like standard things like that, it's going to be on port 443. Like
Right.
if
Yep.
you don't know what the port is in Azure, try 443 first. Otherwise, you'll probably know the port. But yeah, those are kind of the guide to troubleshooting. Uh, Anything else you want to add about Network Watch or anything?
No, I don't think so. It's one of my first go tos probably.
I
Even before like Telnet,
I do want to let's share my screen again because remember they kind of hit it.
they did. Yeah, they moved it around. You and
It
I actually
used to
got on a
be. I
call
think
trying to find it.
it used to be in the VNet, but I don't think it is anymore.
No, it's in the networker. You have to go to the network watcher blade.
Yeah, so you have to
And, you,
search Network Watcher.
and what's confusing is that you've got all these network watchers and these get created for you automatically. But it's
Whenever you create a virtual network
yep,
anywhere. Yeah.
yep. But the tools are now over on the left,
Yeah.
um, which kind of makes sense. But yeah, they moved it on us, and you and I went like we had to go hunt for it.
Yeah. So a couple other things. NSG diagnostics can be pretty handy. It'll show you if you're getting blocked somewhere. IP flow verify. Next hop I've occasionally used, but it's less common because this can work a little bit better to troubleshoot if you have user-defined routes. And VPN troubleshoot can be handy if you're not if your VPN's not working.
Now, the one thing I do like about IP flow verify is that if you're getting blocked by an NSG somewhere,
It will tell you.
it'll tell you. It'll tell you that specific NSG that's blocking that traffic, which is, again, we talked about bad error messages in Azure. That's one that I like, is that, hey, this is what's blocking it. Go fix it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a really, really nice set of tools. I've been pretty happy with it.
Yep, agreed. That's my go-to.
All right, so that's kind of hub and spoke networking. I think we've talked a lot. You'll learn more when we talk about vWAN because vWAN does a lot of similar things to hub and spoke. It's just designed more at a global scale. You're going to run into some limitations of hub and spoke when you start to go beyond, 5, 10 networks and 2 or 3 regions, and that's when something like vWAN can be worth the money. John, you're like studying for AZ700. Where do you recommend people go to get some more information on these topics?
Actually, I'm studying for AZ305.
Okay.
I'm not to 700 yet. I like MeasureUp. MeasureUp has good practice exams. Microsoft Learn has a bunch of content on there. And for me, I learn best when I actually go play around with it.
Yeah.
So having a dummy tenant subscription that I can go mess around with, that has been my biggest advocate to learning this stuff. Especially when I get clients that want to do something similar. I get to talk to experts like yourself and Denny and other networking people that I can actually go do and implement. But those are the resources that I use.
Yeah, one of the things that's really cool about all this network stuff, except for like vWAN and kind of firewall, but it's mostly pretty cheap until we get to. There's a couple of things that cost a lot of money, like DDoS. In firewall, there's a basic tier, so if you just want to experiment with firewall, you can use that. But like if you have a trial subscription or an MSDN subscription, those things can be cheap enough that you can really get started with that.
DDoS, I did find that DDoS can be relatively cost effective if you just do it by per IP.
Oh, it's a lower cost per IP.
It's like, I don't hold me to this. I have to go look, but it's like $25 per IP or something, or $250. I'm sorry, it's $250.
Okay.
$250 versus like $4,000 for the entire
overall service.
Yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah.
So if you got small implementation, you can just do you've got 5 public IPs, do it by IP.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, next time we're going to talk about vWAN. So subscribe and leave feedback. And we hope you enjoyed this session on hub and spoke networking. And looking forward to joining us on the rest of this journey through Azure networking.
See you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.